You're listening to the Hello World Podcast number 20. My name is Sean Wildermuth, and I am your host. The Hello World Podcast is where you can hear from some of your favorite developers, authors, and speakers about how they got started in this business. We go way back to their first computer, their first code experience, and their first job. Today I'm delighted to have Scott Meyers on the show. Scott Meyers is one of the world's foremost authorities on C++. He wrote the best-selling Effective C++ series, Effective C++, More Effective C++, and Effective STL. He publishes and maintains the annotated training materials, overview of the new C++ for C++ 11 and 14, and Effective C++ in an embedded environment. He is also a consulting editor for Addison Wesley's Effective Software Development Series, and with Herb Sutter and Alexandrescu, is a principal in the conference-like event C++ and Beyond. He has a Ph.D. in computer science from Brown University. Scott's also currently working on a new book, Effective Modern C++, 40 Specific Ways to Improve Your Use of C++ 11 and C++ 14, which he desperately hopes to be finished by summer. I really enjoyed talking to Scott today. Scott's Effective C++ book was really instrumental in my learning C++, as I was sort of grinding through trying to learn C++ and apply what I had learned from Clipper to a really modern language like C++ at the time. We got to talk a little bit about Oregon, we got to talk a little bit about book writing, and about the history of C++ and the compilers around C++. Hope you enjoy hearing his story as much as I did. Let's take a listen. So I'd like to welcome Scott Meyers to the podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing fine. How are you?
And where are you? You're in California?
Oh, please don't say that. No, I'm near Portland, Oregon.
So when did you start getting interested in computers? Did you have one as a kid? Did it start in college?
You know, for me, it actually started in technically it was elementary school, but it was in 6th or 7th grade. So it would have been sort of junior high level. But I'm old enough that there were no personal computers at that time. And so what happened was that the elementary school that I was at had brought in a brand new principal that year and hired an entirely new staff of teachers. And on the staff was a woman named Kathy Reed, and she was right out of school, and most of her colleagues at the school were also right out of school. So they were young and they were excited, and apparently the principal had said, you have free reign, you can do almost anything that you want to.
Interesting.
And she had found out that there was a time-sharing computer at the district central, some location, and that there apparently was either money available, or at any rate, there was the opportunity for schools to get teletypes and then to connect to the mainframe using the teletypes, and that could be used for educational purposes. And she didn't know how to program a computer, but she thought this was just, a great opportunity and couldn't possibly be passed up. And so somehow arranged to get one of these teletypes placed in a former cloakroom at the school. We didn't even have closets; we had cloakrooms. And
you can't possibly be as old as you're describing teletypes and cloakrooms.
They were cloakrooms. I would hang my coat in the cloakroom, and I don't think I found out till 20 years later what a cloak was. It was just one of those funny kind of things. Anyway, and so this teacher, Kathy Reed, came down and she found me and a couple of other people. We must have been recommended by other teachers, probably because they were anxious to have us put into the cloakroom, and came and introduced us to this funny machine, this teletype. And so that was sort of how how I got started was playing around, doing actually literally playing computer games on the teletype with the paper output.
Go left, and then it would print out a line and go right.
Yeah, exactly. And we actually had a lot of fun playing on that machine. But that was, I think, probably 1974.
Oh, wow.
So this was, long before those pesky personal computer things started coming out.
Before, we needed anything more than 64K of RAM, or in my case, 5K of RAM. Yeah.
Yeah. So it was just, no, they were different times, actually.
Yeah. Very.
So that was the beginning of the whole business.
And did that sort of light the fire of what you wanted to do? Were you one of these kids who, stayed in his room or in the computer lab all the time?
At the time, yeah. So I was in like sixth grade at that point. That was near the end of the school year, and then, as far as I know, nothing happened over the summer because school was closed.
Sure.
And then in seventh and eighth grade, this was just the obsession for a friend of mine and for me. And so we'd be in school all day long, and then we would be hanging out in the cloakroom between 3:00 in the afternoon and 6:00 in the evening, which was when the computer at central location went down, and so we were forced against our will to go home. And we got first we started by just kind of playing games and stuff on the computer, and it's sort of funny in retrospect because one of the games we played, I remember it was a game called Lunar. And what Lunar was basically, it was a lunar landing simulation. And so remember, this is completely textual, and it's printing things out on paper. And so the initial conditions are like, okay, you're in the landing module and you're this far above the moon. I don't remember how far it was. And you have this much fuel. And so at every time period, you can either decide to use some fuel or not use some fuel. And if you could use some fuel, you got to say how much fuel you wanted to use, whatever it was. And so it would print a line and say, so how much fuel do you want to use? There's, you're this high, this is your velocity, and this is how much fuel you have left.
And so it's ostensibly turn-based, right? I mean, it's not really timed, is it?
Well, I mean, it would be actually a time-based thing because you'd say, okay, I want to burn this much fuel. And then it would come back and say, okay, now you're this high going at this speed with this much fuel left. What do you want to do?
Interesting.
And so I assumed that it was simulating some amount of time, and I don't remember how much time it was. Mm-hmm. And so, so you sort of play around with that, trying to figure out how you can land on the moon. But what's sort of interesting in retrospect is that, so the goal of the game is to land on the moon. Well, but once you've learned how to land on the moon, I mean, that's kind of dull, right?
Yeah.
So then you start thinking, well, okay, how fast would we impact the moon if we didn't use any fuel at all? So you just type 0 the whole time, and so you crash in the moon and you at some velocity, whatever it happens to be. And then you think, if we used all of our fuel right at the beginning to go as high as possible, then we would be at a higher height, and then we'd fall down even harder, and we could slam the moon's surface even more. And what I think is funny is, you kind of look back, and this is all about edge conditions and trying to figure out what happens under bizarre conditions that are not supposed to occur, right, which is sort of a life skill for a programmer.
It really is. It really is. A lot of the early software I played with was obtained, let's say, maybe not completely legally. And so I never got docs. I never got books or any of those sorts of things. So that skill of going, okay, I have something running and I can just press every key to see what happens, which is sort of what I did back then. That is a crucial skill in learning new languages or IDEs or whatever skill set you're trying to learn, in that you're not afraid to make a mistake, right? The worst thing that happens is you restart and in your case, the worst case was you were finding that edge condition. That's exactly what we do as programmers. Yeah,
it's just a funny kind of thing. And another one of the, it was actually an application, but we thought of it as a game. And this was you answer a bunch of questions and it tells you what careers you would be suited for.
Interesting.
Which you can sort of think, you can see why this would be on an education-related computer. Mm-hmm. That might be something which people would be interested in. And so it would ask you a whole bunch of questions. Do you like being with people? Would you prefer to be outdoors? All these kinds of various questions. Mm-hmm. And so we would play that game and try to find out, what we were suited for in life as we were, at junior high age at the time. But again, after you found out whatever it was, and I don't remember what it was, then you start playing, well, all right, this would be sort of interesting. So it would say things like, are you blind? Well, yes, I'm blind. And do you have any handicaps? Well, yes, I'm in a wheelchair or whatever it was. And so you just started giving these very, very strange answers, and from our perspective, we won the game if it was unable to come up with any kind of a career recommendation for us, which, by the way, is possible. So
that's interesting.
So we did that for we did that for 1 year, and I found out later that Kathy Reed, who sort of started this whole business, she didn't know how to program a computer, and she didn't really know how to play very much on the computer. It was just sort of an idea that she had encountered, and so I think that at night she was probably going home and desperately trying to stay one step ahead of us. So eventually we learned the basics of basic programming. Which is a very good way to occupy young men for short periods of time.
It is.
And so we did that for quite a while. And then that would have been for the equivalent of 7th grade. And then in 8th grade, she came up with this idea. She said, I'm going to have you guys teach the class because you know more than I do at this point. So why don't you, put together some instructional materials and figure out what you're going to teach, and we'll have a class in computer programming. And, this is the 70s, and it's all about, kids learning and trying new kinds of progressive educational ideas. And the administration of the school was very supportive of that at the time. So my friend and I ended up teaching a computer science class, which probably went about as well as you can expect for 13-year-old boys to be teaching classes in school. Sure. And what I remember most about that is when I was done with that, I said, I am never going to become a teacher for the rest of my life. This is just a horrible way to have to deal with things. So, yeah, and there's a certain degree of irony there, and that's kind of largely what I do for the most part.
Yeah.
So that was 8th grade. And then what's sort of interesting, because your question originally was about, lighting the fire and the passion and that kind of stuff. And it certainly had been there for 7th and 8th grade. And then I went to high school, and for some reason, I had absolutely no interest whatsoever in doing computers in high school.
Well, it's certainly not cool when you start to, be attracted to the opposite sex. It's not the thing you want to, you want to, you want to say that you're a guitar player and that you skip school. That's, not that you skip school so that you can, write basic programs and trade software with your friends. That's not as attractive to the opposite sex as you might imagine. Yeah,
that's true. And I'd love to be able to say that was the reasoning behind my not doing that, but I'm not really sure I can blame this on my social life. It was probably just more, I had different interests, whatever they happened to be.
Yeah, sure.
So for 4 years, I really didn't do anything with it at all. And what I do remember is a friend of mine in high school who was doing, computers, and I thought, geez, how geeky are you? So he was doing programming languages, kind of learning funny programming languages. And so he came up to me one day and he goes, I am learning this language called Snowball. And I thought, that's just sick. That's just weird. And then this other day he goes, I am learning a programming language called C. And I thought, well, that's just the dumbest name for a language I've ever heard in the world. I mean, that's not cool and sexy like BASIC is. So
it's not even an acronym. Is it a one-letter acronym?
Yeah. It's just, there's a language that won't be around for very long, let me tell you.
Yeah. What happened to B?
Yeah. Well, it was BCPL, as we know, but that's a whole separate issue.
It is.
And then, so the high school, computer science story is very short.
So let me go back one step. So you were doing basic programming on the teletype, correct?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So how does that, when I started playing with computers, they had screens. So this has been a question that's always been curious. Are you able to sort of, write one line at a time and then, type list to see the program and then type run to run it? I mean, was it that sort of experience?
Yeah, that's what you do.
All happening on paper. So,
Yeah. Well, essentially what you do is it can't be that dissimilar from line editors. And I think even on Unix, they've got Edlin or something like that. And so essentially what you do is you enter edit mode, and in edit mode, you start typing in source code one line at a time. And in BASIC, every line begins with a lane number.
Yep.
And so, which has the truly odd thing in BASIC for those people who may not know it, that you can type your lines in whatever order you want to. Because, if you say line 10 and then line 20 and then you say line 13, well, line 13 goes between lines 10 and 20 when you execute the program.
And you have to make sure you leave enough numbers in case you do need to. I mean, I remember that in early BASIC is, I would run out of numbers between 10 and 20 and then have to renumber.
But then you issue the renumber command.
Oh, really?
And yes, at least on this particular version of BASIC, and when you issue the renumber command, then every line becomes a multiple of 10 again.
Oh, wow. That's smart.
So when you run into that situation where you need something between lines 10 and 11, then you just do renumber, and 10 stays 10 and 11 becomes 20.
Wow.
And so then you basically issue the renumber command, and then you tell it to print out the program again, and it prints out the whole program with the current line numbers, and then you start editing again.
Interesting.
And then when you're done with that, you leave edit mode, and then you can execute the program.
So it's not that different than, my first basic experiences. It's just that, when it went off the top of the screen, we couldn't pick it up off the floor and read it.
On the other hand, you could refresh the screen probably somewhat faster than a long program could be printed out.
I would bet that's true. Even on my 13-inch used black and white TV, it still was faster. So back to when you had heard about this language C in high school, but did you play with it until you got into college, or was this?
Like, I didn't do any programming at all in high school, and so I wouldn't bump up against C or Snowball for that matter for many, many more years. So then I went to college. I went to Stanford University, and as a freshman at Stanford at that time, part of the orientation was that you could choose to go and sort of be exposed to different things. So you'd have a tour of a lab, or you'd have you'd meet with the professors. I don't remember what all the options were, but what I do remember is I decided I wanted to go and see the Stanford AI lab, which was called SAIL.
Oh, okay.
And there was a robotics demonstration there. So this was 1977. So I went up and I saw actually what I thought was a very cool robotics demonstration and that kind of stuff. And I was going to study biology, which is what I ultimately ended up studying.
Interesting.
But I was also really interested in taking lots of classes. And so you could take at that time at Stanford up to 20 units of credit. And I had signed up for 19 units and I had 1 unit left. And I was like, the school costs a lot of money. I need to make sure I get my 20 units. and they had a 1 unit class in SAIL programming. And SAIL also stood for Stanford Artificial Intelligence Language.
Oh, wow.
And so I said, well, it doesn't sound too hard. So I signed up for SAIL. I took my 1 unit in SAIL, where the only thing I really remember about that is the comment I got from one of the TAs, because SAIL, it was an ALGOL-like language. So it looked a lot like Pascal. But because it was a 1 unit class, you didn't really have a lot of classroom instruction. And it was really for probably people who already knew some kind of a language and just needed a quick intro into this other language for doing other kinds of studying. It wasn't really designed for freshmen.
Right.
And so I knew how to make programs run. So basically, I wrote BASIC, except that I used the SAIL syntax, and I got my programs to run. So this poor TA sent me this note. Wrote a comment on one of my programs and said, "This is not Fortran. We do not program like this in SAIL." And I, of course, was highly insulted because I was not writing Fortran. I was writing BASIC. It was a completely different thing.
He had guessed the wrong language.
Yeah, so it's like, please, I'm sorry. I'm not like one of those people. I declare my variables rather than, defaulting based on their first letter.
Exactly.
So, but then at some point, I started taking regular classes at Stanford, sort of on the side. Pascal was the big language there.
Yeah.
And so I learned Pascal, and it wasn't until I went to Stanford didn't have an undergraduate program in computer science. So I majored in biology, which is what I had planned to do. But I had been taking computer science classes kind of on the side for fun. And it turned out that by the time I graduated, I was most of the way toward getting a master's degree in computer science, which I didn't realize I just had that many credits.
Wow.
And so I decided to stay on for 1 more year and finish my master's in computer science. It's like, I felt like, well, I'm walking down the sidewalk and it's just sitting there, so I should pick it up.
Yeah.
And
just one
so
more
I took
year.
a course I took a course in comparative programming languages, and that was actually when I met Snowball for the second time. And ever programmed in Snowball, Sean?
I have. To be honest, I was thinking whether I'd heard of it, but I've certainly never even seen it.
So Snowball, actually, I remember sort of 2 things about it. One of them is white space is a significant operator.
Oh, yum.
So yeah, which it actually has different semantics depending on where it's used.
Mm-hmm.
And the second thing is all functions return Boolean.
Interesting.
There are probably going to be people listening to this and they'll correct me if I'm wrong, but my recollection is all functions return Boolean.
Wow.
So everything returns true or false. Which had a certain, so I took a comparative programming languages course. So I programmed in Snowball for 3 weeks, and then we programmed in, I don't remember the other languages for various amounts of, we programmed in PL1, not PL1,
okay.
APL for a while. APL for 3 weeks.
Wow.
I liked Snowball, actually. Snowball was an interesting language, and it polluted my at that point, of course, pristine Pascal for a while, because I thought, well, this is great. I'm going to have every one of my functions return Boolean for the rest of my life. Well, it wasn't the rest of my life, but it did last for a while. It was very strange.
Interesting. And when did, I know you more because of C and C++ than anything. Mm-hmm. When did that become a big part of what you do?
Well, so after I graduated from Stanford, I worked for about 2 or 2.5 years as a software developer. And I got really bored. And the reason I got really bored is because my experience was I had a fun company to work for, and they said, okay, this is the software we want you to write. And you'd sit and you'd think about it for maybe a half an hour, and you go, oh, okay, I can see how we can do this. And it was like, I knew where I needed to get, and the only thing between me and getting there was a large number of hours of typing, editing, and debugging.
Right.
But the actual solution, I mean, I sort of knew how I was going to solve the problem. And so the first time they said that, here's what you need to do, I said, great, and I did it. And then they said, okay, now we need you to write this other program. Well, the other program, it didn't do the same thing, but conceptually it wasn't that different from the first one. And so you sit and you think about it, you go, okay, that's how I'm going to solve the problem. And then again, large number of hours of typing, editing, and debugging. And by the time this happened, maybe a third or a fourth time, I said, this is not really that interesting anymore.
Right.
And
you're solving the same problem over and over again.
It was, similar problems.
Sure.
And I like learning new things. I like having new stuff all the time. And I knew that I liked going to school because you are confronted with new things all the time. So I eventually went to graduate school and to get my Ph.D. in computer science. I went to Brown University in Rhode Island. And so my first year I had to be a TA in the software engineering class, actually. So the professor for the class was sort of in an interesting situation because the class was on software engineering. And the only requirement that the computer science department at the university had was the students in this class have to come out knowing how to program in C. Because the upper division courses are in, or at least at that time were in C at Brown.
Interesting.
And the lower level courses were in Pascal. That was the teaching language. So this software engineering class was essentially the transition which would take them from being Pascal programmers to being C programmers. But the professor of the class thought, really, as a software engineering language, C is not the ideal choice. And so he said, okay, this is what I'm going to do. He goes, I'm going to teach them C, and then we're going to switch to C++ because C++ is a better language for software engineering. And this would have been, I think, 1988.
Oh, wow.
So, so I had taught myself C essentially over a weekend earlier that year, maybe the year before. I honestly don't remember. I guess it was the year before. So I was never actually a C programmer, and to the extent that I know about C now, I actually know about C as a delta from C++.
Sure.
Because I really learned C++ in order to be able to be a TA in that software engineering class. So that's how that whole business started.
Wow.
So,
and was it a language that you liked at first, or was it just perfunctory? This is what I have to know, therefore.
It was really the latter. It was really, this is just what I have to know.
Interesting.
It was. I have to TA this class, and in order to TA the class, I have to learn this language. Therefore, I will sit down and I will learn this language. And I enjoyed programming, and I wasn't terribly picky about what I programmed in. Mm-hmm. And so, that was just sort of the way that it was.
Interesting. Mm-hmm. And how did that transition into what you did, post grad?
Well, so one day, so I was a graduate student, and I sort of need to. All right, so I had a job before I went to graduate school, and so if you have a job, you get paid. And then I decided that this whole getting paid thing is vastly overrated. So I'm going to go to graduate school, where you don't really get paid.
Right.
We got support for being PhD students, but it's not quite the same thing.
No.
And so then a professor came. Well, so the other thing you need to know is that at least at that time, and even now, there's a lot of training companies, and training companies get hired by various clients to go and teach them various technical skills, whatever it happens to be. But it's difficult for the training companies because if you're a training company, the hot technology this year could be completely different from the hot technology next year.
I'm vaguely aware of that. Yeah.
Yeah, it seems like you might be in a position to be aware of that. And so as a training company, you don't really want to hire people as full-time employees because the technical skills they have this year could be super hot and really important. And next year, people could be wanting to learn about something completely different. So ideally, what you really would like would be to be able to hire people sort of on a part-time basis who are very technically skilled in whatever happens to be hot at the time, and who are really good instructors and have very flexible schedules.
That sounds like graduate students.
Doesn't that sound like graduate students?
It really does.
And so a professor came in to me and one day he said, "How would you like to make more money in a week than you normally make in a month?" And I thought, I would like that.
Yes.
That would be good. So that was sort of my introduction to doing training. So it turns out he knew a guy who lived up in Cambridge, Massachusetts, who was a broker for training. So I did some stuff. I did some stuff in the C shell for a while. I actually did do a couple of training courses in C. And then this would have been probably around, 1990-ish, something like that.
Nice.
And then the owner of that training company said, we're beginning to get requests for C++. So could you put together a course on C++? And I think that you and some of your other people you've talked to have pointed out that if you really want to learn something, what you need to do is teach it to other people.
Yes, absolutely.
And, I would actually go one step further and say that if you really want to learn it, not only do you want to teach it to other people, but you want to teach it to other people in written form where they can't ask you questions and you can't see if they're confused by looking at their faces. That's kind of the next step.
Yes.
So a friend and I put together a course on C++, which is in that realm in the sense that when you're putting together the training materials in the first place, you don't have anybody in the room who can ask you questions.
Right.
So that was the beginning of the C++. Now, this was introductory C++ at the time, and also at the time, pretty much anybody learning C++ was already a C programmer.
Right.
So the idea was these were 5-day hands-on training courses. And, you started off on Monday morning with a bunch of C programmers, and in theory, on Friday afternoon, you delivered a bunch of C++ programmers. And I think it's difficult for people to sort of think back on this kind of stuff. But if you're a C programmer, and so this is 1990, C++ was a much smaller language at that time. There's no templates, there's no exceptions. There's a lot of stuff that's not there.
Right.
No multiple inheritance. But even so, just the basics of C++ from a C programmer's point of view, you've got to learn about classes, and you got to learn about public and private and protected, and you've got to learn about constructors, and you've got to learn about destructors, and you've got to learn about overloading and default parameters and overloaded operators and virtual functions. There's a huge amount of stuff you've got to learn.
And even just the concept of object-oriented programming, right? You have to kind of start there if they don't already have that basis, because coming from C, you're not going to have a lot of that.
I guess it sort of depends on how you look at it. My feeling, my approach was to say, listen, you've got structs, which is a bunch of data, and then you write functions which work on the data in those structs. So from there, my perspective is it's just kind of a hop, skip, and a jump from there to the concept of object-oriented programming. The syntax looks funny, but at any rate, yes, you have to pick that up too. And so I found out two things about that. One of them was that, so this would be a 5-day course. And the first thing I found out was that I have to strip them of all of their C ways of thinking about things. Because if they're still thinking in C, it's just not going to work.
Right.
And it's especially difficult for these people. And it turns out the better the C programmer, the harder it was to train them.
Sure.
Well, because if you say something like, let's suppose you have a bunch of different structs of a bunch of different types, and you'd like to invoke the appropriate kind of function on each one, you're sort of trying to figure out how to explain virtual functions.
Right.
Well, C programmers, if they're really good, they go, well, that's no problem. You just have an array of function pointers. What's the difficulty? So you had to sort of get past that, and you also have to sort of help these poor people try to understand the difference between a pointer and a reference.
Right.
Which, if you think about it, is a really artificial distinction if you're already really good with pointers.
Absolutely.
Anyways, so it turned out that usually by the time we got to Friday afternoon, these poor people, their heads were swimming. There were so many things they had to remember. And so I started getting into the habit of we'd go to the whiteboard and I'd say, listen, it's not that hard. There's just a few things you really have to remember. So look, let's just write them down. So if you've got a base class, it needs to have a virtual destructor. If you've got a pointer in your class, you need to have a copy constructor and you need to have an assignment operator. Your data member should always be declared private. And started writing these things down as rules. And after a while, different groups of people would say, you really should write a book about that. And I thought, I'm not going to write a book about that. And after it had been suggested enough times, frankly, it was like, well, I could do my Ph.D. research, or I could write a book about that. and the Ph.D. research was hard. And the book, I'd never done that before, but it didn't sound like it'd be that hard. So ultimately, that was how Effective C++ got written. That was my first book. But it was very much motivated by trying to help people making the transition from C to C++ to be able to make sense of what seemed to them like a very complicated language. And, I was fortunate that it worked out pretty well.
Yeah, pretty well. So to speak.
That worked out pretty well. And, the big surprise, to be honest, has nothing to do with the book or anything else. But I do remember in around 1990, which was I was getting close to graduate to finishing my PhD, and so my wife and I were talking about sort of the future and what we're going to do and stuff like that. And she's like, well, how long are you going to be doing this C++ stuff? I said, well, it's a programming language. It's not going to last that long. I give it 5 years tops. So, here we are 25 years after that. And so the language has legs. You got to give it that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I about every 5 years, I have to make that context switch to whatever I'm going to next care about. And I can't imagine still talking about Clipper, which would have been what it was 25 years ago for me, right? I'm still teaching Clipper. That would, maybe that's my next Pluralsight course, Clipper.
So now this one's C++ has turned out to be big enough and beefy enough, and then of course in recent years where they're really turning up the acceleration for how quickly it evolves. There's always more there. At least right now there is. And
is it my imagination, or does it seem like there's sort of a C++ renaissance right now in the last maybe 3 years? It seems to. At least I'm hearing more about it than I had, since I put down ATL a number of years ago.
Yeah. I think it depends on what you mean by renaissance. And I know that Herb Sutter and some other people at Microsoft talked a lot about the C++ renaissance. And from what I hear, if you look for evidence of, for example, a greater number of people programming in C++ by looking at, job listings or the DIOB programming language index or whatever it happens to be, my understanding is there's not a lot of evidence for that.
Interesting.
What I do think has happened is that basically, C++ was standardized, practically speaking, 1997. Officially, it was 1998.
Right.
And then there was what was called a technical report in 2005 that essentially augmented the standard library. And then there wasn't a new version of the language itself until 2011. So, 13 years is an eternity in the programming language landscape to not change your programming language.
Yeah.
So I think, for example, you said you're hearing a lot more about it. I think people are hearing a lot more about it, but I think it's because starting roughly 2009, 2010, people began to realize that there was this very significant change to the language coming out. And for people programming in the language, they needed to learn about that. Plus, for people programming in other languages, they just sort of said, whoa, that language hasn't rolled over and died yet. Who knew? Yeah. And then since 2011, so there was a new version of the language in 2011, and this year there's going to be another version of the language, C++ 14. At this point is all but a certainty is going to be adopted officially by ISO.
Interesting.
And the standardization committee has changed its thinking about releases, whereas when they were working on C++ 11, they sort of said, okay, here's the list of features we want to put in the language, and then let's sit down and write up the standards to make that. which is the equivalent of saying this is the features we want our program to have, so we're going to sit down and write the program, then we'll ship it when it's done. And for subsequent releases, they said, we're not going to have that model any longer. What we're going to do is we're going to try to ship a new release roughly every 3 years. Mm-hmm. And what we're going to do is when the cutoff comes for finishing a document for the next standard, we're going to say, look, which features are currently in a stable state that we think we can ship? And whatever is available is going to ship in the next version. And if it turns out that there's a feature that we're working on and it's not ready to go yet, that's okay. It can wait 3 years and it'll pick up the next version of the language.
Well, that's interesting because that's kind of what's happened to software development in the last 15 years, right? It used to be that you wrote the 400-page spec and then you went and built something for 4 years instead of this, incremental releases of something that's more of a live version instead of these monolithic versions.
Yeah. So it's, I wouldn't call it agile, and that would be
an
exaggeration.
To avoid that word.
Yeah. Well, but let's put it, it's more agile.
Yeah.
But I think that also they're trying to avoid certain kinds of issues. It was frankly kind of embarrassing that in 2009 there was no such thing as a thread in C++.
Right.
There was no official acknowledgement of that existence. So they were trying to avoid that. But as a result, I think you're going to continue to hear a lot more about C++ because C++ essentially went into sort of a quiescent period for about 13 years.
Yeah.
And that's not going to happen anymore. Plus, they've got there's more people engaged in standardization than ever before. They're working on a lot more things than they ever have before. So I think that as I said, the rate of evolution of C++ is accelerating, and all the signs are that it's going to continue to accelerate for at least the next several years.
And are the compilers keeping up?
The compilers are actually keeping up pretty nicely. Okay. So GCC does a pretty good job of keeping up. What's really interesting has been Clang. Are you familiar with Clang?
I'm not.
Okay, so it's Clang stands officially for C-Lang. It's the C front end on top of LLVM.
Oh, okay.
And what's interesting about it is that like 3 years ago, I'd heard of Clang, but it had no significance on an industrial basis, I don't think. And these days, Clang is beginning to be used in production work. Apple's behind it, Google's behind it, some other companies are behind it as well. There's been a lot of work done on Clang. And my understanding is that at this point, they are currently shipping, or they're ready to ship, a version of their C++ compiler, which is completely conformant with C++ 14 draft standard.
Wow.
GCC is right behind them, and then there's some other compilers which are a little bit further behind than that. But compiler conformance is surprisingly good at this point, which is great for a lot of programmers. On the other hand, a lot of C++ programmers are cross-platform developers.
Right.
So they're writing for Windows, and they're writing for Apple, and they're writing for Unix and stuff like that. And for those people, they often find that they can't start using a new version of the language until all of the compilers that they depend on are using that version of the language, supporting that version of the language. So there's sort of a spread in terms of how quickly people can adopt new language features. And the people who are dependent on only one compiler, they can do it a lot more easily than the people who are dependent on many compilers.
Of course, that makes sense, because you're trying to get that baseline of what you can rely on.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely. Well, this has been a great discussion. I really appreciate you coming on the show.
Oh, well, thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
And enjoy the rain. I mean the weather. I mean the rain.
Everything out here is lush and green and kind of glowing because we're in the springtime. All the leaves are nice and fresh. So I'm happy about it.
That's all.